So I'm Shirley Jordan. I'm Professor of French Studies at Newcastle University, and I'm also co-director of the Centre for the Study of Contemporary Women's Writing at the Institute for Modern Languages Research, which is hosting this afternoon's event. I'm really happy to welcome you to this event. This is the final event of a raft of events devoted to the subject of care that we've run throughout this month. And 3 of those have been organised by Jasmine Cooper and Katie Plemming. Katie, I'm told, is unfortunately unwell and unable to join us, and will be watching the proceedings from her sick bed, I think. That's right. So all I want to say is thank you to them. Thank you for the total of 6 speakers over the 3 seminars that they've brought together. They've been fantastic, and I'm sure that this afternoon's event will be a fitting finale to that succession. So thanks very much indeed, Jasmine and Katie.
Thank you so much, Shirley, and again thank you to the IMLR for hosting this event. As Shirley rightly said, this is our final session entitled Care and Neoliberalism, and we're delighted. I'm going to use the we because I'm imagining that Katie is here with me in spirit. And we're so delighted to have 3 fantastic speakers, Lisa Dowling, Alice Blackhurst and Emma Dowling. And we're going to kick right off because, as I said, we've got 3 speakers, and this is a slightly longer session, and about an hour and a half. So do stay around for questions at the end. So to begin, we're going to be starting with Professor Lisa Dowling. So Lisa Dowling is Professor of French Discourses of Sexuality at the University of Birmingham in the United Kingdom. Her most recent books are The Subject of Murder, Gender Exceptionality and the Modern Killer, published by University of Chicago Press in 2013, Pharmacology, Critical Essays on John Money's Diagnostic Concept, co-authored with Ian Morland and Nikki Sullivan, again published by the University of Chicago Press in 2015, After Foucault as editor, published by CUP in 2018, and Selfish Women, particular favourite of mine, published by Routledge in 2019. She is currently writing her next book, a manifesto entitled Against Affect as a Leverhulme Fellow. Lisa's title for this session is Strategic Selffulness Beyond the Neoliberal Co-option of Self-Care. Over to you, Lisa.
Thank you very much, Jasmine, and to everyone who's been involved in the organisation of these events. I've very much enjoyed the previous 2, and I'm looking forward to today's. I'm going to try to share my screen with you and hope that this works. So, the who of the question, who cares, that underpins this whole seminar series is an important one, as the suggestion that caring is what one does or should do is not a suggestion or imposition that is meted out evenly. For this reason, to the question, who cares, I feel inclined to respond, I don't, and I won't. I am, of course, being deliberately provocative with this statement, and I both do and don't mean it in a multiplicity of senses, as I shall go on to explore. It is well established that caring is a feminist issue. From Evelyn Nakano-Glenn's book Forced to Care, which shows the disproportionate and poverty-making burden of care for women, especially women of colour and migrants in contemporary America, to the concept of wife work introduced by Suzanne Maushardt, writers constantly make the point that care is work, and moreover, that it is work that is gendered, racialised and classed. In my book, Selfish Women, I ask the question, why are women who prioritise their own interests, who prioritise self rather than other, presented often as a category error, a puzzle and a cultural problem? I argued for a strategic embracing of female selfishness in the context of a political discursive field in which female altruism, the duty to care, is the coerced norm, but is made to pass as natural. My argument was that it is hardly feminist to presume as an innate quality something that has long been both a demand and effect, often detrimental to women, of female social conditioning. The specific self-focused value of self-care was only marginally touched on in my book. I focused instead strategically on the terms selfishness, self-interest, and proposed a neologism, selffulness, as these are terms that suggest a logical, cerebral weighing up of benefits and costs, rather than an unconscious or emotive response mechanism. I use selffulness there to describe an ethical, consciously assumed position of refusal of the feminine virtue of selflessness, since, as Mary Wollstonecraft tells us, feminine virtues are mere flattery and perversions of real virtues that are designed to keep women in our place. Selfish Women is a thought experiment, an exercise in thinking against the grain. As the gendering of the term care is, as we have seen, so helpfully overdetermined, I wanted to try to map out a relation between woman and self that might look somewhat different from what we've come to expect. And this thought experiment with the whole imaginary field of the rational, thinking of women through thought rather than feeling, is an interest I've carried on into the book I'm currently writing, Against Affect. In this paper today, to balance those concerns with a rational self-interest and to respond to the theme of this series of events, I'll be paying specific attention to the concept of self-care. In some ways, my paper speaks to the one given last week by Jamie Weinstein, though I'm not proposing an ethics of indifference as an alternative to ethics of care, but rather the specific feminist ethics of self that I call selffulness, while maintaining that level of suspicion of care as an unalloyed good. Now, it has become a commonplace to note that the concept of self-care in late-stage neoliberal capitalism has been deformed from something radical to something defanged. Self-care as an ethic had radical philosophical meanings in various traditions. Most relevantly for our purpose today, perhaps, these include work inspired by Michel Foucault's late writings and the work of women of colour feminism. I need to change my slide. I don't quite know how to. Give me a second. There we go. In the former context, Foucault examined how, for the ancient Greeks, caring for the self was the fundament of moral life. He notes how estranged from such a notion we moderns have become, writing that we find it difficult to base rigorous morality and austere principles on the precept that we should give ourselves more care than anything else in the world. We are more inclined to see taking care of ourselves as an immorality, as a means of escape from all possible rules. We inherit the Christian morality, which makes self-renunciation the condition for salvation, end quote. As with other examples of Foucault's turning to ancient principles in volumes 2 and 3 of the History of Sexuality, he tries both to understand the present and to heuristically seek insights into ways of healing its wounds via his explorations of the past. The notion of care for the self, borrowed from the Greeks, served Foucault as the basis for his theorizing of a practice of freedom and has been influential for numerous feminist critics, as I shall go on to discuss. In another context, that of the writing of radical women of colour, the message of which we're reminded is that for some groups, self-care is more than a path to freedom, though it is that as well. Self-care is survival. Audre Lorde famously writes, "Caring for myself is not self-indulgence, it is self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare." Far from these notions of self-care as a pathway to radical freedom or to fundamental survival, self-care in the present has become something that serves capitalistic interests more than those of the individual or the group, while also transforming the individual from locus of agentic ethical consciousness to automaton-like consumer. Black journalist Kathleen Newman-Bremang writes of how, via what she terms the glaring whiteness of the wellness industry, self-care has been turned into something very far from a tool of radical opposition to systemic anti-Black racism, class inequality, and political injustice, end quote. The French beauty brand L'Oréal's famous tagline, "Because I'm worth it," exemplifies everything about the trend that Newman-Bremang identifies and critiques. It insidiously implies that a woman's value lies in her appearance, that whiteness and blondness are high status features, and that investing financially and psychologically, literally buying into, both that commercial and patriarchal notion equates somehow to the essence of self-esteem. Angela Mcrobbie has written extensively on the manipulation and deformation of self-care to shape both the consumer habits and the attitude to self of women, especially young women, in the late 20th and 21st centuries. She uses a Foucauldian model of subjectification in her body of writing about the ways in which neoliberalism has infected prescriptions for self-care, replacing doing it for yourself and being good enough with an impossible prescription for perfection. In an article on competitive performance, perfection culture rather, from 2015, Mcrobbie describes, quote, a heightened form of self-regulation based on aspiration to some idea of the good life. She writes of the ways in which the neoliberal iteration of feminism equates female success with the illusion of control, with the idea of the perfect. And she blames this turn to individual striving on a discarding of the older, welfarist and collectivist feminism of the past. In Selfish Women, I argued that the technologies of individualized perfection that Mcrobbie critiques are not actually individual in a meaningful way. Like the identikit faces of L'Oréal seen on the previous screen, this idea of perfection is a burden shouldered by the individual, but that speaks to a massifying idea of conformity and sameness. To the problem of the atomization of neoliberal culture, Mcrobbie proposes welfarist and collectivist imperatives as the properly feminist solution. However, the path to selffulness, I argue, can lie in neither direction, neither unthinking compliance with neoliberal norms, nor a nostalgic idealization of collectivism, but must be found in another way. The problem is not, or should not be, a recognition of the individual, of a fuller sense of self. Indeed, wresting this away from a purely neoliberal framework strikes me as an urgent project. We need critical tools for distinguishing what is a matter of individualization, as per Mcrobbie's critique, and what is a matter of individuality, consciously, fully, and resistantly assumed. A further and different feminist response to the neoliberal co-option of self-care can be found in the pro-technology feminist project known as Xeno Feminism. Related to the projects of transhumanism, biohacking, and accelerationism, this strand of theory and activism fascinates me. It shares some of my own interests and seems to be asking genuinely novel questions about feminist possibilities and futures. Primarily, it is a pro-rational feminism, and it is this quality that most draws me to it. In the manifesto A Politics for Alienation by the collective Laboria Kubonix, it is stated, xenofeminism is a rationalism. To claim that reason or rationality is by nature a patriarchal enterprise is to concede defeat. It is true that the canonical history of thought is dominated by men, and it is male hands we see throttling existing institutions of science and technology. But this is precisely why feminism must be a rationalism, because of this miserable imbalance and not despite it. There is no feminine rationality, nor is there a masculine one. Science is not an expression, but a suspension of gender. However, along with the valuing of technology and reason, the imperative to adapt it to feminist ends, and the downplaying of the natural or essential as good, all of which I concur with, xenofeminism also seeks to evacuate individualistic selfhood, the I, from its gender politics. This is a name from which I differ, since my position is very much that, just as rationality has never been assumed to be for women, so women have never been assumed to be individual selves. A collective existing for the good of the other already defines our condition under patriarchy. One way in which xenofeminism reimagines self-care for our age is in the practice of feminist DIY healthcare, via an adaptation of technoscience outside of medical institutional settings. In her short polity book, which is an introduction to xenofeminism, Helen Hester describes how since the 1970s, feminists have, quote, sought to seize collective control from vested industrial interests, end quote. By mastering techniques of insemination, abortion, and gynecological examination, feminist self-help is an attempt, in the words of Barbara Ehrenreich and Deirdre English, to, quote, seize the technology without buying the ideology. This techno-medical doing it for yourself, where the self is collective, offers Xeno feminists a way to bypass both the protected and paternalistic authority of the medical profession and the commercialization of healthcare, especially in a US context, that makes patients into consumers. What is striking here is that the case of medical hacking in Xeno feminism is a very concrete example of how, done in different contexts, technologies of self-care can equate to accelerated forms of freedom. What is also important is that this form of feminist praxis moves us away from natural ideas of the proximity between women and care that is established via the insistence on biological functions and the kinds of practice it is presumed to necessitate, i.e., such praxis decouples the biological capacity to bear children from an innate or natural compulsion to either wish to do so or to caregive. I quote from the manifesto again. Anyone who's been deemed unnatural in the face of reigning biological norms, anyone who's experienced injustices wrought in the name of natural order, will realize that the glorification of nature has nothing to offer us. The queer and trans among us, the differently abled, as well as those who have suffered discrimination due to pregnancy or duties connected to child rearing. Xenofeminism is vehemently anti-naturalist. Essentialist naturalism reeks of theology. The sooner it is exorcised, the better. Freeing up, then, the idea of the feminist subject from an idea of the natural seeks to destabilize long-established links that have worked against autonomous self-definition for marginalized and non-normative subjects. I finally want to turn to a brief consideration of Maggie Nelson's recent book, On Freedom, 4 Songs of Care and Constraint, which yokes together the 3 concepts of freedom, care, and constraint in a series of particularly intriguing ways by the case studies of art, sex, drugs, and the environment. I found the section on art particularly rich. The book takes a concept, freedom, that has become increasingly associated in the cultural imaginary with the interests of the right wing, especially alt-right, and examines its complexity and enduring importance to all of us as inextricably linked with the questions of care and limit. Nelson is unflinching in this book in dismantling a number of shibboleths. She writes initially of the sense of freedom offered by not caring in the field of art, a field that, she says, has latterly been preoccupied by what she calls the reparative turn. This is a term designed to suggest that the healing power of attending to affect in art results in a sort of ethics of care, or an aesthetics of care, perhaps better placed. In contrast to this trend, she writes, quote, I have long valued art's not caring as a portal to forms of freedom and sustenance that differ in key ways from those engendered by politics, therapeutics, or direct service, end quote. Nelson posits creativity then as a not caring that can expand the horizons of the imaginable, suspending anxious soul searching for the time of a reading encounter, and enabling a consciousness of freedom that would be an alternative form of self-care to the socially prescribed ones. Yet Nelson's suspicion of our hyper-self-critical and care-burdened epoch is not in the service of an amoral or libertarian agenda. Rather, it is in the interest of revealing an increasingly judgmental and anti-intellectual trend, in Nelson's words, quote, towards diagnosing some art or artists as caring and some as not, with the latter treated as capable of wounding, traumatizing, or otherwise inflicting harm, end quote. This presupposition leads, she argues, to a consensus that not caring about one's critics, including not making or doing or saying what those critics would prefer you make or do or say, is ethically negligible. And I agree with her largely that this consensus is one that needs to be resisted in a number of ways. And her point here is not explicitly feminist. She doesn't dress this as a feminist point, but I wish to extend it in my reading in that direction. Like Nelson, I value writing, be it literary or theoretical, for the extent to which it enables us to think otherwise, to challenge, question, or push at norms from whichever political direction they have emerged and solidified. This was why I argued for a strategical embracing of female selfishness, a strategic non-caring in selfish women. I wanted to resist that which is the coerced norm, even if it is not overwhelmingly positive, wholesome, or good. When women in particular refuse to do care for other and self, that is, according to the rules of the day, to do care properly, the charge of being ethically negligent that Nelson raises here in the context of literary criticism is especially pointed and potent. To conclude then, by my reflections on my own past work, on strands of feminism that engage with and challenge the notion of self-care, and on Nelson's recent invention into the relationship between care and freedom, I've argued that what is at stake in refusing to care in the ways we are told we are supposed to care is precisely a commitment to a practice of freedom. And practice of freedom is, of course, a Foucauldian formulation that Nelson also makes use of in her book. Refusing to care obediently may well involve choosing to care in ways that are deviant or countercultural, and therefore emancipatory. Feminist writing may envision practices of care that go beyond or fall outside of the ways in which self and freedom are imagined in the purely neoliberal or market-driven ways we are familiar with, and in the ways that are endorsed by earlier strands of feminist writing. I can say then that I defiantly don't care. That is, I refuse the societal obligation to do the work that implies, and I insist upon the importance of seeing both self-care and other care as forms of labour, rather than as natural extensions of sexed or gendered subjectivity. On the other hand, I very much care about, that is, invest intellectually and politically in, projects like the ones I've discussed in this paper, projects that seek to rethink and to reframe both care for the other and care for the self in the conscious interests of feminist futures that respect individual flourishing alongside the good of an emergent collective. And I will stop there because I've probably spoken for longer than 20 minutes, in which case I apologise. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lisa. That was so fascinating and wonderful. Thank you ever so much for that. We are going to take questions at the end. So please do, if you have any questions, do make a note of them and you'll have an opportunity to direct those to Lisa at the end. So we're going to move swiftly on to Alice Blackhurst. So Dr. Alice Blackhurst is currently a stipendiary lecturer in French at St. John's College, Oxford. Her monograph, Luxury, Sensation and the Moving Image, on the aesthetics of luxury in contemporary French feminist literature, installation art and film, was developed from a PhD defended at the University of Cambridge, was published by Legenda Press in December 2021. Her wider essays and criticisms have appeared in N+1, The White Review, The New Left Review, Texte sur Kunst, and Another Gaze. She is currently, after an invited talk at the Maison Française d'Oxford in March 2022, developing a new research project about incest narratives in contemporary French women's literature, audiovisual material, and cinema. Alice's paper title is The Luxury of Taking Care, Community, Capital, Luxury, and Sensation. Over to you, Alice.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Jasmine, and in absentia, Katie and Shirley and everybody for organizing. Can you hear me, by the way? I'm hoping. Great. My headphones are in, but which is, and can you see my screen? Great. Hold on. I will just proceed then if you can see my screen. Yes, the title of my talk today, you already have in front of you, The Luxury of Taking Care, Community, Capital, Leisure, and Sensation. And I will try I will keep this to time. So in May 2021, In May 2021, a group of women of West African descent, referred to by the French press as the Femmes de Chambre de l'Ibis Batignolles, celebrated minor victory outside an Ibis chain hotel in Clichy in the north of Paris. Having been protesting since July 2019, 8 months of which were on strike, in a campaign against unsustainable working conditions and punitive salaries, an agreement was signed promising to raise their payments to 7.24 euros a day and to reduce their daily quota of work, which previously stood at the grueling expectation of 3 hotel rooms cleaned per hour. A report in the French newspaper Libération referred to the group's, quote, victory as a brief circuit break, une brèche, within wider networks of discrimination and oppression, but une brèche seulement. As the group's acting leader, Rachel Keke, highlighted at the time, il faut faire attention, la sous-traitance est toujours là. One must pay attention, undertreatment is always present. I evoke this incident in France as one possible way of introducing the charged overlapping concepts of luxury and care in a precarious 21st century environment. In my broader research, I explore how contemporary feminist Francophone practitioners in film, literature, and installation art respond, mainly through the broad prism of visual culture, on a formal and aesthetic basis to the challenges of neoliberalism via acts of pleasure, embodied affect, and the senses. Yet also how luxury in particular as concept has been mobilized within a Eurocentric, predominantly metropolitan French framework to consolidate hierarchies of exclusion and elitism and privilege limit experiences of transgression and extremity. Conceptually, luxury and care meet in the attention to and empathy towards craft, choreography, order, design, and the minor details that support and make everyday life bearable. Yet the question of who exactly is entitled to the luxury of taking care, here in the sense of being able to curate, assemble, and aestheticize the raw materials of one's own life, or faire de sa vie une œuvre d'art, after Michel Foucault, and which stories are excluded from mainstream dissemination, is an urgently ongoing one, some of whose ramifications I want to begin gesturing towards in this brief presentation today. So in the belief that the aesthetic carries consequence for contemporary configurations of care, and for the sake of somewhat condensing this enormous topic, I'll split my presentation between 2 case studies, the multimedial conceptual art imprint of Sophie Call's Hotel Room series, and a short film by Margaret from 1978 titled Les Mains Négatives. So beginning with Sophie Call's L'Hôtel. In 1981, the French conceptual artist Sophie Call, known for her impetuous explorations of intimacy, the contours of affective life, and the often porous boundary between internal and external experiences, concerned herself with a very specific organization of lived space and leisure time, the luxury hotel room. Spending 3 weeks working as a chambermaid in a Venetian establishment in Italy, her artistic project, later exhibited as installation art and published as a book with the publishers Act Sud, and in December in a new Baroque English language edition with Siglio Press, was to make inventories and take photographs of the possessions guests left in their rooms, and to meticulously note the traces of how they used the space and amenities. Affirming well-worn conceptual art practices of thrifting, thrifting, and making monuments out of waste materials, the work with signature Cal playfulness and moral ambiguity orbits the hotel room as a site of reprieve or exception, or to use further Foucauldian terminology, a heterotopia, where the experiences of retreat, refuge, and the polyvalencies of self-care often belies the actual material labor of caretaking. A shuttle between solipsism and what Sandra Logier calls attention towards otherness, attention à autrui, is a dynamic that freights Sophie Call's artistic career, both invested in performances of sovereignty, but also the effacement of authorial identity. In the artist's own words, quote, "I like to have control and lose control," end quote. Within Cal's broader oeuvre, care is a well-worn signifier. Her 2007 work, Prenez soin de vous, or Take Care of Yourself, chosen to represent the French pavilion at that year's Venice Biennale, and later exhibited at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France in 2010, reveals the frequent vapidity of the term care in a contemporary heteropessimistic context, in which relations between men and women in particular often default to transactional type. Prenez soin de vous' polyphonic project, a way of, in the artist's words, quote, taking her time in the wake of a blindsiding separation, departed from an out-of-the-blue Dear Jane email from her then boyfriend, the French memoirist Grégoire Boulier, informing Cal of his reluctance to commit to their relationship. He signed off with the insipid, quote, "Take care of yourself." Cal subsequently forwarded the email to 107 women from a range of professions and asked them to respond. The late actress Jeanne Moreau, the philosopher Barbara Cassin, a female clown, and numerous successful lawyers, journalists, and copy editors all featured in the project. She also printed out the email and gave it to a parrot, Brenda, who ripped it to shreds. Though Cal, in her authorial preface, the only time where we are made privy to her own interpretation, explicitly couches the project as a way of prendre soin de moi, of taking care of myself, the work evolves beyond Foucauldian ideas of le souci de soi, where the notion of caring for the self is ventured through an optic of self-discipline, to embrace instead an almost ecstatic mode of self-forgetting via a decadent immersion in a swirl of other voices and interpretations. The women's and the parrot's creative richness far outstrip the thin commitment phobia of Boulier's originally careless composition. It is a feminist reclaiming of the presumed gendered, quote, feminine tendency to concentrate innumerable hours to the ruminative labors of interpretation in the wake of being left. L'Hôtel, on first reading, seems to deliberately exhibit carelessness with regards to other people's property and personal ephemera. Cal's only rule for this photographic project of probing, it seems, as Lily Owen Rowlands notes, was to, quote, leave untouched any luggage that owners had had the foresight to lock. That is, unless they also left the luggage key, which for Cal was as good as an invitation, end quote. Forensic dissections of guests' underwear choices, leftover snacks, and personal medication, amongst other items, ensues. For her part, Martine Delvaux has observed how Cal's work operates negatively. Yet Cal's work, if often mining the craters left by people's disappearances, deaths, jiltings, or even just temporary vacancies of temporary residences, generates extraordinary abundance from absence. She takes care of the lacunae left by other people and summons art from them, makes something of her materials to render absence, to quote Roland Barthes, an active practice. While the conceptual premise of L'Hôtel might seem callous, its sequential layout, a neatly numbered layout for each room, with text and image made to mirror one another in harmonious diptyque, is imprinted with Cal's signature meticulous aesthetic cadences. More widely, if Cal's work, as I would argue, Prenez soin de vous' centrifugal, polyvocal premise intimates, is invested less in taking care of the self than in taking leave of the self via immersive experiences of deliberate curation and sensation, then perhaps her interest in l'hôtel is less to protect the privacy of her subject than to take care of the object, to respect and document its resonances set adrift from human use. Delivered from human presence, her photographs acquire the calm voluptuousness of still life tableaux, on which our looking uninterpolated by another's gaze is allowed to roam, linger, and speculate. In Cal's work, the narrow self-interest of le souci in French, which connotes worry or anxiety, and a narrow object of localized preoccupation, blossoms out into the wider, more inclusive stakes and connotations of le soin, responsibility and acts of occupation or involvement, evolving to encompass the thorny question not only of who cares, but of what we care for and why, in a shifting vista of object attachments and transitions. So moving to talk about Marguerite Duras's Les mains négatives. The French writer Marguerite Duras, already notorious for her proclivity towards self-fabulation, infamously liked to postulate that she, in addition to her wildly successful career as a novelist, started to make films out of apathy. I lacked the strength to do nothing, she notes, in the recently published anthology of her film writings, Le cinéma que je fais, the cinema that I make. While the subversive power of stasis, refusal, and withdrawal from robust productivity models freights all of Duras's creative offerings, Michel Royer argues that what motivated Duras to make films was conversely the fact she cared too much about the insufficient transposition of her novels into film by largely male directors such as René Clément, Peter Brooks, and Tony Richardson. So in what remains of my presentation, I'll discuss Duras's 14-minute film from 1978, Les mains négatives, which traces an alternative nocturnal geography of the city of Paris, and in which the extended metaphor of negative hands becomes a metonym for, in François Vergès' words, capitalism's fundamental reliance on the invisible cleaning and care work undertaken largely and on documented hours by people and women of color. I'll argue that Duras's disjunctive film aesthetics in this short yet haunting piece refuses to take care of the spectator by means of offering total absorption in its diegesis, and therefore awakens care in the different sense of vigilance and sharpened consciousness, albeit in a speculative register of abstract art. So overlapping with Cal's interest in the traces and the shapes bequeathed by absence, Les mains négatives, a traveling tour of Paris pre-dawn, punctuated by shadowy shots of workers cleaning the streets and soundtracked alternatively by Duras's own voice, reading from a prose poem of queer asymmetric love and a scratchy solo violin motif, takes its title from the Magdalenian caves at the Atlantic coast, where the imprints of prehistoric hands were found. Yet the spatial imaginary of Les mains négatives in film form is arguably more urban and unstable, designed to jolt its spectator out of mere passive consumption, or what Duras would disdainfully refer to as le cinéma du samedi, Saturday cinema, as mere vehicle of entertainment for casual weekenders. This cinema, once it is ended, leaves nothing after it, leaves no trace, Duras would write, Yet her desire is for Les Mains Négatives to make an uncomfortable impression on its audience, to raise unsettling questions such as who cares for the city when it is left unattended. The audio and visual tracks of the film do not correspond, yet this disjunction between Western music and voices and the labor of immigrant workers refuses the conventional logics of colonial enclosure, brings the designated periphery into jarring contact with the supposed civilized center of Europe, Paris, the city of light now recast in eerie, startling blue shadow. Vergès, elsewhere an attentively sharp critic of Duras' at times colonizing gaze, has written elsewhere how women of color enter the gates of the city, of its controlled buildings, but they must do it as phantoms. Racialized women may circulate in the city, but only as an erased presence. Yet, Les Mains Négatives does expose the circuits of labor, often sanitized and effaced by luxury facades. The film counterposes the exhausting economies of repetitive manual work with the aesthetics of luxury typically synonymous with art house cinema, characterized by slow unspoolings of action, a protracted, drawn-out sense of duration or movement in time, and the illusion of montage or cutting strategies. Yet in refusing to take care of the spectator's absorption, the film hones our looking more closely at both personal and political forms of exploitation. So to briefly conclude, both Sophie Caille's Hotel series, expanded this month in a recently opened show at the Musée d'Orsay, and Margaret Duras' Les Mains Négatives raise trenchant questions of who the subjects and the objects of care are within capitalism's exploitative and contingent spheres of value. They explore how ideas of luxury are refracted through visual artworks that seek to jolt the spectator out of passivity and to develop new forms of attentiveness that tend to and look after public and private fora. To think about luxury in a world currently fractured by unthinkable conflict and residual trauma might seem a perverse act. Yet luxuriating in the sense of taking time with intricate artworks that are curatorial in their capacity to hold space for oscillations and ambivalence in regards to the perennial conflict between satisfying individualist desire and fostering interdependence, can generate new, perhaps, to cite the recent work, the Care Manifesto, more, quote, promiscuous forms of care. To alternatively end with a quotation from Saidiya Hartman's study, Wayward Lives. Beauty is not a luxury, rather it is a way of creating possibility in the space of enclosure, a radical art of subsistence, an embrace of our terribleness, a transfiguration of the given. It is a will to adorn, a proclivity for the Baroque and the love of too much. Both L'Hôtel and Les Mains Négatives create possibility within spaces of enclosure to remap care as a generative, yet ultimately volatile signifier. Though they are not always able to fulfill a straightforward politics of care from within the boundaries of the aesthetic, they are careful in the sense of who they are trying and able to care for. And I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Alice. Again, as such a thought-provoking and brilliant paper. And yeah, thank you so much. Again, just to remind everyone, please do make a note of any questions you might have, and we will move into the discussion following our final speaker, who I'm delighted to introduce, Emma Dowling, who is a sociologist and political scientist and teaches at the University of Vienna. Previously, she has held academic positions in the UK and Germany. Her most recent work asks what our economy looks like when viewed from the perspective of care, charting the material conditions that shape its configurations. She is the author, and I'm sure many of you have read her work, of The Care Crisis, What Caused It and How Can We End It, published in 2021 by Verso Books. And Emma's title today is Antinomies of Care and Control. Over to you, Emma.
Thanks ever so much, Jasmine, and thanks for the invitation. It's really great to be with you today to talk about care. And it's interesting because I think I come perhaps to some of these questions from a slightly different angle, the angle of sociology, but also in particular feminist political economy. And I'm going to touch on quite a few issues that have already been raised today, maybe offering a little bit of a different perspective, or perhaps an additional perspective on some of the questions that have been raised so far. So I will also share my screen, and I think here we go. I will make everybody here small so that you're not looking at yourselves. Okay, that is a blank screen. Let's try again. There we go. Right. Well, I want to also hone in on self-care, in particular in relation also to broader issues of care work and the labours not only of self-care but also of care work more generally. And particularly, I also want to look at what has emerged, particularly in the last years, as a kind of caring capitalism, and look a little bit more closely at that before concluding with some thoughts for discussion. But I'd like to start with this idea of the care fix, which for me is quite a central concept that I use to understand some of the transformations that have been taking place in recent years with regard to care. And what I sought out to do here with this concept of the care fix that I use also in my book, The Care Crisis, that Jasmine has already mentioned, I use it really to try and understand the ways in which a care crisis, so a care crisis I understand to be a situation in which both the access to sufficient or adequate care becomes increasingly difficult, so people who require different kinds of care find it more and more difficult to access those, but also at the same time the increasing difficulties with providing care. So those who are involved with care work and caregiving, both in paid and unpaid forms, having to do so under increasingly difficult conditions. And I think it has already been pointed out today that, as we know, care work is gendered and racialized and also classed. And indeed, the relationship between care and capitalism has never been one that has been free of problems, also free of exploitations and instrumentalizations and invisibilizations of care. But at the same time also, I think when we look historically, we can see that there have been different configurations and arrangements of care that have been more or less stable. And right now, I think we are living through a moment in which previous arrangements have either broken down or also due to the ways in which austerity and also this neoliberalization and the sort of bringing care into the market have taken their toll, have really led to an exhaustion, I think, of societal caring capacities, as well as their uneven and unequal distribution. So what I want to do with this idea of the care fix is really to try and develop a concept with which to look at and explain the ways that a care crisis is addressed or dealt with or managed, but is actually just really kind of displacing the problems and not really dealing with some of the fundamental issues that lead to crises in the first place. And particularly also, I said in the beginning that I come from a kind of feminist political economy perspective. I'm looking at this also in the context of the ways in which Capitalism functions to exploit and instrumentalize care in particular ways, and actually looking kind of at a whole at the economy, we see that actually we can identify ways in which there are sort of attempts to manage a care crisis, but kind of keep capital accumulation on track, keep the economy going, make sure that actually the orientation towards economic growth and capital accumulation is maintained. So this idea of the care fix really tries to understand this kind of displacement of crisis. And I'm taking my cue here from existing theoretical approaches to the understanding of an analysis of capitalism, such as geographer David Harvey, or also sociologist Beverly Silver, who have looked at different ways in which problems of profitability, but also legitimacy and capitalism are dealt with through particular kinds of fixes, spatial fixes like with globalization, or also technological or financial, or also productivity fixes. So I add to this the kind of idea of the care fix as another way of displacing crisis. And this has a particular kind of dynamic. There's a sort of structural reflex to offload the cost of care and the work of care and social reproduction onto unpaid and also underpaid realms of society with, as has already been said today, gendered, racialized and classed implications, and often here also in intersectional ways. So this is really the kind of dynamic that is behind many of the care fixes that we can see. And this obviously also has to do with a broader theorization of this relationship between capitalism as an economic system and its systematic devaluation and also instrumentalization of care work, and also the work of social reproduction. So the kind of broader work that is done to sustain life, but also provide the background conditions for the economy to function by providing and replenishing labor power. So not just caring, but all forms of housework, cooking, cleaning, sexual and romantic emotional relations, also within our personal relationships, not to mention childbearing and child raising. So the third part of this is to understand also that there's a kind of systemic imperative within a capitalist economy for expansion, for bringing ever more areas of social life into the market, into market relations, in the pursuit of profitability. And I think the important thing here is to understand that this doesn't mean a sort of simple commodification, that simply more and more areas become commodified and determined by market relations, but that this actually goes hand in hand with the devaluation of the work of care by making this work invisible or also externalizing its cost. And in my book, I look at various examples of how this happens, also in the context of the commodification of care, say with the ways in which care is also offered as a marketized service, home care, care homes, in the context of elder care. Here we actually can see that the ways in which the profitability of care is maintained actually systematically happens off the back of care workers whose working conditions and wages are diminished. So I think that serves as a good example to show this link between the pursuit of profitability and the devaluation of the work of care. But what I want to look at in the time available to me today is what we might call a self-care fix. And Lisa has already also spoken about this in the context of neoliberalism and the ways in which sort of caring for the self becomes a certain kind of imperative. And what I want to argue here is that there are really two aspects to this that are quite congruent with the ways that financialized capitalism works. So take care of you because you're your own most valuable asset, so the form of human capital that will yield high economic returns if you look after it. So there's this sort of positive investment in the self as an asset. So I think this sits quite comfortably within a financialized capitalism, which is of course orientated towards assetization and the augmentation of the value of assets, and also the management of risk. So here also the self-care as a kind of way of managing particular risks. And those risks, of course, are also connected to perhaps the sort of more negative interpretation of the self-care imperative, namely to take care of yourself because nobody else will. So the context of welfare state retrenchment, the cutting of public services, the ways in which labor markets continue to be deregulated, creating more and more precariousness, and that this actually also acts as an imperative for self-care, because you become more and more fearful of what might happen to you if you are not able to sell your labor power and earn a living, and there is really nobody else to rely on, whether this is because collective solidarity is undermined through certain kinds of individualizations, not just discursively but also materially, through a kind of austerity agenda that I've already spoken about, but also with, I think, flexibilization and greater mobility, there is also a sense in which social ties and forms of community are also undermined. And I think in the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw a kind of contradiction playing itself out here, where there was a kind of obvious necessity for collective care and for recognizing interdependence, and for actually taking care and being mindful and looking after one another, but also the kind of ideological pull of personal responsibility that I think we see and we saw mirrored in a lot of government policy. And so I think this really did bring this kind of contradiction to the fore. But underlining this also, I think, is a kind of generalized anxiety. There is, I think, a way in which these agendas are also fueled by a sense of a loss of control and a worry about the future. And in a sense, is a kind of life in and against a kind of ontological inadequacy. So here, what I mean by ontological inadequacy is that behind the kind of neoliberal imperative to self-optimize, which I think we're very familiar with how that works and what the mechanisms and discourses are, but behind this idea of constantly having to improve and grow and be better is, of course, the suggestion that you're not good enough, that you are inadequate, and there's always something more that you can do. And I would argue actually that there is a kind of renewed interest in self-care, particularly I would say in the last 5 years or so, that actually comes out of the crisis of neoliberal self-optimization and kind of exhaustion with this agenda, where self-care, I would say there's a kind of longer tradition of self-care in the sense of a kind of neoliberal busyness or engagement with the self, but the turn to self-care quite explicitly is also formulated as a kind of coping strategy. So we cannot continue with always doing more and trying to do more and being there for everybody. The invocation of gender here as well, as women as the ones who don't only love too much but care too much. The need to set boundaries, to be able to articulate and express those, taking time for replenishment. All of these ideas are connected to a sort of what Stephanie Graefe, a German sociologist, has talked about in terms of kind of retroactive coping with, or proactive prevention of exhaustion. I think it sort of sits within both these moments. And I think also people like Angela Mcrobbie, who has already been mentioned today in their work on resilience, which Stephanie Graefe has also worked on, are sort of showing ways ways also in which these ideas become kind of folded back on self-responsibility and a sort of coping strategy to deal with the inadequacies actually of the kind of neoliberal self-optimization. And I would argue that this isn't just a kind of malaise of the middle classes, even though I think there are a lot about it points in that direction, but this kind of self-care solutionism is actually quite pervasive. It finds its way into a kind of workfare agenda, but it also finds its way into caring professions, also in the context of the COVID pandemic, the ways in which self-care is sort of upheld as something that is a crisis management strategy, even lots of kind of digital apps and platforms and things, manuals to assist with this. And so I think it becomes the kind of go-to strategy in lots of different contexts that also cut across class and privilege. And the reason why I wanted to think about what I wanted to talk about today in terms of the sort of antinomies between care and control is that I would argue there is something behind these strategies that has everything to do with feelings of disempowerment. And so a kind of drive to gain a sense of safety, which obviously can risk tipping into a kind of dysfunctionality. I'm not going to talk about this today, but in my book, for example, I look at things like clean eating and argue that that is very much fueled by a kind of sense of anxiety and feelings of a lack of control. Of course, that sits very well within what we know how eating disorders function. Now, not everybody who's interested in clean eating, I would argue, has an eating disorder, but there are certain ways, I think, in which this idea of responding to the ills of industrial capitalism again is sort of folded back into these this sense of anxiety or worry about what might be in that food, and trying to gain control over a situation in which one feels that one has very little control or doesn't really know who to trust. You know, there are kind of competing truths out there. You don't really know what information is the right information. And so the kind of personal responsibility really comes to the fore. Who are you going to trust? You have to become your own scientist, your own doctor, your own nutritionist to really manage the risk of all of this information, and often also contradictory or opposing information. And again, I think this is also mirrored in the ways in which also healthcare and medical care also epitomize and invoke that sense of personal responsibility and choice. And I do think here there is something ambivalent about the kind of affective register. Lisa mentioned her new book project, which sort of takes issue with affect theories, and at least that's how I understood how she explained what the project was. But I hear there's something about the ways in which the body as a kind of container of anxiety, but also a tool for providing certainty, kind of function together. So there's a kind of orientation towards feelings and sensations, and ways in which also this kind of self-care agenda is connected to trying to interpret bodily functions and feelings and sensations in order to gain knowledge about oneself, and also to engage in the right kinds of conduct that will generate a better sense of self. Having said that, though, I would also say that I think at the same time there is a way as well that the body kind of reemerges here also in the wake of the ways in which our lives have moved online and become more virtual. So perhaps there's also something here about how feelings and senses of exhaustion and not being able to continue to cope in these ways are also connected to this moment as well. So I think there's a kind of ambivalences here that it can be interesting to unpack more. Another aspect that I think is quite central here, and something that I've been quite interested in exploring, is the ways in which these developments are connected to a kind of metricization or quantification of self-care. And there's quite a lot of work being done on the quantified self. Phoebe Moore and others have done a lot of research into this. But there is this aspect too that I think it is also interesting to unpack in terms of not just being able to measure and count things in terms of a sort of accounting for the asset self. So the ways in which ratings and measurable outcomes can be routed through financial markets for the purposes of extracting surplus value, managing and averting risk and putting a price on these things, but also how metrics are connected to relations of power. So the imposition of measurement is not a kind of post hoc form of accounting for what has already been produced, but metrics themselves are forms of power that have social effects and they shape conduct and thinking. I think also here, Deleuze's postscript on society of control is quite interesting, but also the work of others who have tried to really get to the bottom of the ways in which forms of measure and the ways that metrics function and the way that they're actually put together and what it is that they measure and how that is deeply implicated in power relations. And overall, I'd say there is a problem, though, because this sense of control remains quite elusive, particularly in the face of continued social, economic, political, and also environmental crises. So one of the things that happens, I think, as a consequence in the way that this sort of new self-care fix functions is as a kind of presumer citizenship. The unpaid labors of self-care get fed back into a sort of consumption agenda where there is an idea that democracy is somehow synonymous with the market. So conscious consumers seek to educate themselves and also assist companies with product optimization through feeding back information online via social media and other things. There are also, of course, a whole host of self-care apps that I'm not going to go into much detail here because of time constraints, but are also drivers of financial accumulation and ways of undermining public health infrastructures. But I think one thing that's also quite interesting here is a kind of social change as entrepreneurism. And this is where I think there's a kind of new quality to it that is more recent than a kind of longer neoliberal agenda, namely that there is a sort of rise of this idea of responding, as I already said, to the ills of industrialized capitalism in various ways. But one can't really imagine anything other than it being rooted through the market, coming up with a good business idea, being an entrepreneur of change, precisely because there is a sense that regulation doesn't help, governments can't do anything, a sort of general sense of disempowerment. And the only thing that really works or that could be imagined is sort of a rerouting through a kind of entrepreneurial and consumerist agenda. And I think also here ways in which social reproduction and care work as a whole field of work is invisibilized in the ways in which practices of care become moral questions about appropriate individual behavior as opposed to being questions of labor. So to finish off then, I think I did want to say a few words also about the inequalities here, because of course, who gets to have a self, who gets to fashion a self and assert a self, and who does the work of helping others to have a self is deeply enmeshed in relations of inequality and class. David Graeber is somebody who also pointed out that the working classes are also the caring classes, and that a lot of the work that we do is actually work on one another, but some people do more of it than others, and some people are involved with assisting others to have this self that is being proclaimed as that to be achieved. I'm not going to talk so much about Audre Lorde because she has already been mentioned, but I think what matters here is precisely this kind of tactical malevolence of her idea of care, self-care as warfare, because the whole point was, of course, that some lives matter more than others, and that here survival is in itself an act of resistance when the person you are and who you are and your position is not something that is considered to have value. And all the while, of course, responsibility for care is being offloaded again and again through gendered and racialized and classed ways. So to conclude, I think that we are seeing a kind of rise of a sort of caring capitalism in response to a lot of the problems that have become visible with the limits of neoliberalism, but also a crisis of care. In the wake of coronavirus, there's been even more of this, calls for people to care more, to be more compassionate. And the critique that I also develop in my book is that there is a way in which the structural conditions for caring are rendered invisible through this focus on care as an effective disposition or a moral behavior. And so really what I am suggesting is that we have to unearth the structural conditions for caring and look at this as something that has to do with questions of not only of work, but also how the material relations of power and wealth that underpin the control over the reproduction of livelihood are organized, maintained and reinforced. And I would say that that way in is a way to really start to be able to have a conversation about what needs to happen in order to resolve and end a care crisis, than simply calling on people to be more caring and care better for one another. Thanks very much.
Oh, thank you so much, Emma. Another amazing talk. We've been incredibly lucky today to have such wonderful speakers. And I'm really hoping that those of you that have made it this far might have some questions that you can pose our panel. You're welcome to raise your hand or put them in the chat, and I can read those out. So I'll just give you a minute to mull that over. 3 different approaches and ways into this question, but in many ways some really interesting overlap. And yes, so I'm just going to give you all a minute to have a little think. I suppose one of the things that I'm so interested in, this idea of care washing, and I think this is one of the things that strikes me about this question of care. And when Katie and I were thinking about this topic is we've just, Lily, I'll come to you and maybe I'll come to you straight away, and I'll kind of come back to my point, because I really want the audience to have as much say as possible. So hopefully you'll be able to unmute yourself.
I was really struck, Alice, in your fabulous paper about this. I mean, you put it really beautifully about the attention Cal directs towards objects of care, and I'm really struck by how that sits in tension with a total absence of actual cleaning in the project, right? So she goes and it's kind of like cosplaying a cleaner for 2 weeks as a sort of durational performance piece. And she really is disinterested in what the housemaid is supposed to care about, right? So like dirt and mess and reproducing the hotel room as though it was this new space where there was no real life. You know, it's emptied of the trace of life. And so I just wondered how you interpret this, and if you see any tension in her disinterest in the subjects of cleaning, which to me is really, really obvious in the way that she never talks about her colleagues in the project. In fact, the other housemaids are totally absent from the narrative. And the more obvious political investments and interests of Duras, who, you know, directs her attention towards the figure of the worker.
Thank you. That's a great question, Lily. And I, was very, very inspired by your particular writing on L'Hôtel. It's true, and I think that's where the filmic, sort of the film that it was inspired by Cal's L'Hôtel, the chamber, Lilia Alvilez's 2019, The Chambermaid, which takes very loosely based on Cal's project, but which transposes the setup to a luxury hotel in Mexico City, and that is very much about this network of chambermaids, plural, and indeed that does get effaced in Cal's own investigation. I think you're right in that there is no attention there's no care shown towards the object in the sense of tidying it or tidying around it. But I think for me that's a striking way of exposing the sanitized facades of hospitality culture as fallible, or the charade of that perfect, creaseless hotel room space. And in refusing to bend to that, I think there's something not politically faultless, obviously, but there's something interesting in how that refusal to care gestures towards, I think, the invisibilized presence of people who are in the background cleaning it all up and like refusing, and that maybe links to Lisa's talk as well. But in refusing to care, there's a space that's opened up, inviting the spectator and the audience to question, well, who does do the work if not Cal, you know? So I think it's a really interesting point, and I thank you for it. And there's certainly an individualist focus going on here, but I do think that there's a refusal to conform to the tracelessness in a way that opens up questions about who is in the forefront and who is invisibilized. So that is a great point. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lily, and thanks for your response, Alice. Actually, maybe one of the points in your talk, which I found maybe kind of weaves together some of all across the three talks, was this kind of idea, well, the luxury. I mean, Sophie Cal says, I like to have control and lose control, but that struck me also as this potential, kind of working from Lisa's talk, as this kind of chosen, in a sense, this kind of having some sense of sovereignty, but not necessarily needing to be an authority or to be a kind of I don't know, this kind of tendency for one woman to be made an example of and standing in for all women. And there's something in that which I found quite interesting. And then this. Well, anyway, sorry, I've just got distracted by one of my notes here. So, but I was thinking about the potentially, like, some of the ways in which, whilst I really agree with someone like Nelson, and again raised by Lisa, that we art the freedom of art to not care. There is this kind of real tension at a moment of crisis where we find ourselves. That do you think there's ever, I guess this is a question to Lisa, and then maybe Emma, maybe as well, you might want to reflect and be able to reflect on this from a slightly different standpoint, but do you think there are moments where it is important that art or artists do care, not just as a kind of like tokenistic gesture? Do you think there are moments, for example, in the last couple of years or right now, when we don't see people speaking out about injustice in a time, I don't know if you kind of get what I mean, but there are moments where actually we should really make a stand of caring, really, or does that seem like a potentially hollow exercise just based on a kind of performative kind of care kind of caring gesture?
I don't think it would have to be empty or performative. I suppose it depends what you exactly mean by care, and if it's being used as a synonym for compassion, because that also seems to happen quite often.
I definitely don't mean it as that. But it's this way in which some people do have much more privilege, well, not privilege, but much more reach, much more impact, much more a kind of sway, and they have platforms, and but that can be part of a kind of using one's position in a kind of broken system, but in a way to affect some good, or to be kind of working against kind of systems of oppression. So the example that always comes back to me, and as many problems as I think that there are with this, but when during the Black Lives Matter movement, for example, lots of very widely followed people on Instagram gave up their platforms to gave up their Instagram channels as platforms for activists, etc. And so gestures like that, where there are modes of collective or community that can be kind of generated at moments where there should be kind of an ethical imperative to use your kind of position in society. I don't know if that really makes sense, Lisa, but hopefully I'm kind of getting close to what I meant.
I mean, in the Maggie Nelson example, she's talking specifically about art, I think.
Yes.
Because in all kinds of ways, it's become unfashionable to talk about art in the way that we used to talk about art, right? There's something very nostalgic in her book that I found at once kind of surprising, because people don't do that anymore, and also quite intriguing, and it kind of sucked me in. Because with sex as well, one of the things she seems to be saying is that there are these spaces in our otherwise very kind of ordered, institutionally structured lives, which are spaces to be kind of not perfect, to be, not to do the right thing, to not be caring necessarily. And she seems to see art and sex as two spaces that are incredibly sort of loaded with these imperatives to do the right thing, to be seen, to have the right view, etc., but where all kinds of other energies come through. There's always something libidinal and psychoanalytic in her understanding of both art and desire in that book, which I wasn't necessarily expecting to find there, and which I think I kind of found quite refreshing, given that everything is such a purity test at the moment, and she refuses to do that. But she's refusing to do it not in an apolitical way. She's refusing to do it for the space of this book in order to get us to reflect upon the processes by which we ask ourselves questions, and where ethics might really be, ethics that we have carefully considered and that we stand by, and where there might be, as you were saying, some quite empty gesturing being demanded, being coerced, particularly of certain groups in both the artistic and political spheres. So I think, it's tricky, but I think they're really interesting questions that the book opens up, even if one doesn't agree with everything in Nelson's On Freedom.
Thank you.
Sorry, I don't know if that answered your question.
No, it does. And my question was quite muddled, but you've clarified my thinking. And I think you're totally, and actually when we were looking to prepare this seminar and thinking through I was reading that Maggie Nelson section, and I highlighted all the bits that you quoted because I found it fascinating. And I had to go over it a few times, because you're right, there is something kind of nostalgic and quite challenging about this idea that art shouldn't always care, which does work against this kind of, to use your own words, this kind of purity test at the moment that goes on in the contemporary. So thank you so much. I'm going to move straight into, we've only got 5 minutes left, so I'm going to get straight to this question for Emma that's come through in the chat. Thank you for the intriguing exposition. Following Sandra Mezadra's idea on labour, do you think that care works inherently presuppose an, quote, uneven distribution of pain, close quote, of the body of caregiver and care receiver, apart from the idea of self-care? On the other hand, how to avoid the trap of affective remuneration, since care also includes the happy altruistic feeling to take care of someone, even though it presupposes power imbalance? So that's in the chat as well for you, Emma.
Thank you. Okay, 4 minutes. And we've only just begun to have a conversation, because I think I do think there is something really important right now that we have to unpack and also challenge around the sort of resurgence of a heightened kind of moralism and the disciplining that goes with that, and the ways that that care and caring gets instrumentalized discursively and otherwise in that agenda, and also the kind of implicitness, I think, of a lot of forces that consider themselves to be critical. And so I think there's something going on there that we need to unpack, and I do think that a feminist materialist understanding also of labor and of the ways in which thinking about how we actually reproduce our livelihoods in common, I think there is a contribution to that discussion that comes from there, that pushes beyond this sort of simplistic and rather moralistic understandings of care, that also counterpose liberation from exploitation and oppression with care. And I think there is something has also happened there in terms of saying, well, is the conversation now about how we need to care more? What happened actually to an agenda of liberation from exploitation and oppression, and freedom is something that, as Lisa, you quite rightly said, has been kind of hijacked by the right, and actually also there is a long tradition on the left as well that sees that as something that's important, but in different ways from the right. Anyway, so it's about bringing these aspects back together again as well, but not in a way that's nostalgic and points to the past, but looks to a different future. And there, I think, also disability justice movements that have critiqued a lot of the ways in which caring discourses render people who receive care as passive, and the paternalistic ways that functions. There's a lot there also that points to something different. Also critiques of the sort of punitive ways that the welfare state has functioned, I think, are also important here, and pointing to something or moving to something different in the future that doesn't just look to the good old days of the kind of post-war compromise between capital and labor. There are quite a few questions in the chat. The one about authors, if the person who asked me that question wants to just drop me a line, I'm happy to send more references. But the second question on the uneven distribution of pain and the body of the caregiver and care receiver and effective remuneration. I'm going to start from the bottom. Thanks for mentioning that, the concept of effective remuneration, which is a concept that I developed in a paper where I tried to understand the ways in which the exploitation of unpaid work, particularly in the context of volunteering, relies on forms of remuneration that are effective. So you do something because you care about it. You do something because you hope that you will get something out of it, like volunteering as a student or something. But also and there are even more ways in which that has become part also of newer kinds of agendas around social investing and social impact investing, where volunteering is seen as something that actually produces value for the person that does it, but they can also be part of a sort of new ways of thinking about welfare. And so effective remuneration has this kind of function. And the question here, I guess, is how not to fall into that trap because caring is also something positive. Well, I mean, these are the ambivalences also of caring, right? There is something about care that we also want to embrace and not just refuse. And the other thing is also about care is when you refuse it, that has consequences. And it's not easy just to say, I'm not going to care, because the people who rely on care will face the consequences of that. So there are these problems, I think, that come with care that are not easily resolved. And so I do think that there is something here about thinking precisely about these kinds of problems, but then also trying to shift the line of conflict in a way. So the ways that people are pitted against one another in market relations, so the ways that care workers and their demands for better pay and better working conditions are pitted against the worries of the taxpayer as the care recipient around the rising cost of care. And so a question here would be, what are the processes through which we could shift that line to create a sense of commonality between the care recipient and the caregiver that doesn't reproduce the ways in which people are being pitted against one another? I think that's an important point. And on the first question, I'm not entirely sure whether I've understood it correctly, but I think that there is always an uneven distribution of pain, as there is an uneven distribution of so many experiences. And here, I guess it is a question of trying to find the kinds of commonalities that allow us to construct ways of reproducing livelihood differently and in common. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. I guess I just had a final question before we close, because we are now slightly over, but I was just wondering about the placement of the body. I know, Lisa, you're trying to move maybe away from the body in some of your work, but I was wondering about how you position embodiment and the body in your kind of move away from affect and towards the rational, and how you see that working in your new project.
Just a very quick answer. I'm not actually trying to get away from either the body or feeling as things that we experience in the world. I'm trying to interrogate the weight that they have discursively in contemporary discourse. So the language of feeling being weaponized in all kinds of spaces, the COVID pandemic being a great example. So it's not really about sort of saying, oh, affect theory is rubbish. It's more about sort of re-evaluating I suppose ways of thinking about problems that don't necessarily fall back on because you feel something very strongly, you're right. Because I do think that's something that we have to grapple with in a sort of critical way that has an eye to fairness, justice, ethics, and not just ceding our position on the grounds of emotive appeal.
Thank you so much. And yeah, absolutely. Well, I can't wait to read your book. I think it's going to be fascinating. And I'm gonna have to wrap things up there. And I just wanted to extend huge thanks and gratitude to our speakers, not only for their time, but also their energies and their incredible papers. So thank you ever so much. And also a huge thanks to all of those who are in attendance and all those who watch online, making this a great resource and perhaps a beginning of a wider discussion about care in the 21st century, in the kind of, in this new at the beginning of this new decade and at very turbulent times. And final thanks to Shirley and the Centre for Contemporary Women's Writing. And we'll hopefully be able to bring these thinkers together and hopefully bring out a publication. So if we can go into more detail of all of these, but in any case, be very well, everyone, and thank you again. And it was a great pleasure to be the kind of host today, but Katie also sent her thanks. So thank you, everyone. Thank you so much. Thank you.